So you've spoken candidly about shifting perceptions of the US in Asia and rising geopolitical fragmentation. What must a small state like Singapore do to stay secure and relevant in this uncertain global environment?
And the number of your question is, how does a small country survive in global affairs or thrives? Particularly if geopolitics is fractious and unpredictable and conditions not necessarily friendly towards small states. It very much depends on worldview, not only of the country, not only of its citizens, of the political leadership and political reality. And for Singapore, I would say a starting point is we take the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. No matter how much we wish it to be, some people wish the world to be more friendlier, to protect small countries, to find space for all countries. But that's not the reality. I mean, one of the reflections, I think, across generations of Singapore leaders has been what is articulated in the Million Dialogues. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. Not that it lent itself to nihilism or that even that small countries don't have agency, but that you really ought to start from asking yourself, what are the currents and what's your place in geography and history? And so from our point of view, we have tried to be useful to both our neighbors as well as to big powers and middle powers. I would say our foreign affairs as well as defense diplomacy is very eclectic, and we try to find common ground. At the same time, working with a group of like-minded countries that have the same values and our interests are aligned. And I think that's worked largely for us. Now, if I address the first question, where can we find value? Or where can we give value in our relationships? I think from the defense point of view, it's sometimes in terms of physical aspects. For example, the US, since our MOU, since the 1990 MOU, we've allowed American ships and planes to go through our bases, and they find that useful. So that's anchored on that. But that's not the only aspect. With other countries, it's a matter of exchange of information, our views. They find it useful that we are good observers of particularly of our region. And when defense ministers come, whether or not they take seriously your views depends on how much value they find in your comments. If it's too pedantic, too prescribed, doesn't go beyond the script, you're playing it too safe, then after a while the exchanges becomes very scripted and routine. And they stop asking, if you like, sensitive questions, because even if they do, you don't give them answers. So I think that's a matter of judgment. And over time, I think we've managed to establish ourselves as a useful interlocutor, somebody that doesn't have vested interests beyond national interests, which they can understand, that doesn't try to manipulate others with your views, but also gives honest assessments. So one, physically; two, if you like, exchange of information. If small countries can have it, our equivalent of soft power. Three, as a facilitator. We don't seek to be a broker. I think we don't have strategic overreach. But when asked, I think we offer a meeting ground for even parties which disagree. So for example, the Wang Ku talks in 1993, or the meeting between C2C and Ma Ying-jeou, or the meeting between Trump and Kim. We never proactively offered, but when asked, we were happy to do it. So broadly, I think that's how we would describe what we do, but obviously there are specific questions that you might want to ask following that.
So if you could focus on maybe defense ties, for instance, yeah. So during your tenure, Singapore did deepen defense ties with major powers and also regional partners, what were some of the toughest balancing acts that you had to do behind the scenes, and how did you, as Minister for Defense, navigate them?
Personally, I've never subscribed to the idea that you could balance big powers between China and US, for example, specifically. I think that's a bit of to me, hubris and not realistic. You don't have that kind of agency. Big powers, if it's an interest to do things, they will do it. Even with regard to larger countries like us, let alone a small country like Singapore. So that can't be the starting point. And from time to time, when people see our relations with both sides have been good, and they say, why don't you mediate? I laugh it off, because that's not our role, and we should never subscribe to it. We're not in a position to do so, and as I said before, US and China don't need us. They'll have to deal with each other because they are superpowers, both of them. But within that space, and when big powers are also filling up their data banks, for example, they want inputs, third-party inputs, if you like. They know that they have their own conceived view of another party. They know their machinery, their government machinery does that, their think tanks. But they're also sourcing for if you like, a third-party or independent view. And that's where Singapore can be useful. Because we're seen as a system that both accommodates East and West, if you like. Partly language, partly our multiracial composition, but partly because we have a first-class diplomatic corps, we have a very good civil service, and information flows thick and fast through our system. So we give distilled views which stand the test of time as well as experiences. Because remember that leaders, when they meet each other from many, many countries, they also get to evaluate what so-and-so said to me previously, and does that sync with reality? Is that a useful information? And they're assessing all the time. And you want to be in a position where somebody says, oh, this person said this to me, and that really makes sense. And it's tested so that they would value their engagements with you. So we've tried to do that from the US perspective, and I presume your question refers to US and China. From the US perspective, we've put our money where our mouth is, and when we say that we support US's military presence in Asia, that's the reason for our MOU. But we also say to them that a strong military presence without economic leadership in this region is a brittle one to predicate global power. That America gained its strength and acceptance, and it wasn't outright acceptance by other countries within ASEAN or Asia, because it played a leadership role not only in security stability, but because it championed a global system in which global tide lifted all boats. We say to China that there are concerns that as they grow big, that their assertiveness may encroach into the space of other countries. And we share our views on the South China Sea. We share our views on cross-straits tension. We share our views on other things. And we say to both China and US, that if ever there was a confrontation, Asia is the biggest losers. We would have lost a generation. They may not be coming back for at least, or maybe decades. And you really want to assiduously avoid being close to the border of confrontation.
Is this an approach you share with the regional leaders as well, when you interact with them?
The regional leaders, we work basically through ADMM, which is ASEAN. And of course, regionally, we mean ASEAN. And yes, through the ASEAN ministers meeting, and from the defense track, the ASEAN defense ministers meeting has become the de facto security architecture for this region. That's an achievement. It's 10+8 now, and we've added observers from a few other countries and is growing. And that growth and that desire for other countries to be part of it reflects, I think, a growing acceptance that ASEAN can play a important, even a central role in that security architecture. So I think that's an accomplishment. But as we share, I think we're not under any illusion that all national interests are aligned. We're not the EU. And even in EU, one would argue that not all the time are national interests aligned. It's very hard. But we tried to find a common space. So far, it's been the rule of law, a system that both benefits small and large states, dispute mechanism through non-violent means, and certainly not through war. And these are common principles that we push, our zone of freedom and neutrality, the Treaty of Amity with ASEAN. I mean, these are common, if you like, platforms in which we can build a consensus. So, I mean, that would be our approach, and I think we've been effective somewhat. You know, obviously, we could have been more effective, but I think there is some satisfaction that we've made some ground in terms of, you know, both regionally and internationally.
Military diplomacy is your hallmark of your tenure. The Prime Minister called you the chief defense diplomat, highly regarded in the circles by your peers and counterparts from within the region and outside. How did you grow into this role? And I'm just wondering, you've outlined the storms ahead of us. How long more can this military diplomacy be effective for going forward in the view of the major power coercion?
I don't know if what all you've said is true, but you know, I'll answer the question. I mean, how long can we play a useful role? And I said that we don't start from the position that you can balance big powers. To me personally, that smacks of strategic overreach, an overestimation of your capabilities as well as your position in life, either as a person or as a country. And I think it's in a blighted trajectory. The reality is that the moment big powers, even middle powers, assert themselves and push for their own national rights over others, over common interests, over global commons or regional commons, someone, if not everyone, loses. So you start from a position that, well, for my country, this is right. For your country, it may not be so right, but I assume a hierarchy of needs, and my needs are greater than yours, and I'm going to push my view. Now, obviously, if everybody takes that view, then that common space shrinks, and there will be losers and winners. So our task, I think, is sometimes explaining that and trying to find common ground and trying to get countries to stay away from the red line. So when I was once invited to Aspen, and when the late Joe Nye, now, who was a remarkable person of his own right, I mean, interviewed me, I explained to him our history with China and why Taiwan was a deep red line for the Chinese government, for any Chinese leader. It's the core of political legitimacy. Not that they didn't know it, but having a third person from Singapore say so adds weight to that view and tells them that if you want to cross this line, please think twice, if not more than that. And you have to decide whether that's worth achieving your core interests and at what price. Again, nothing that I've said couldn't have been said by someone or that they didn't know it. But I suppose when a defense minister from one of the ASEAN countries says so, it gives pause. And the things that I say in public were repeated in our private meetings, of course with more detail and more, since it's in confidence, with more salience and directness. And you know that you have become effective when the exchange gets a bit more fluid. You know, when we start, sometimes you have meetings where all you do is read what prepared lines for you, and your officials go through it and say, this is our position, he reads that. And most of us who've been long enough in this circuit will say, that wasn't a very productive meeting. I could have sent to you my talking points and you sent to me and we take it as read. But you know that you've been effective, and I think this happened quite a few times with the Chinese counterparts, when they put down their notes and they want to start talking. And then it becomes very useful. And it shows that there's some confidence, that they value your views, and then you can, within limits, exchange your information. So, I mean, you asked the question, when did I start doing more of this? I really don't know. We meet many people. In Singapore, I would say that our diplomacy and our defense diplomacy, and as I said, we have a world-class diplomatic corps, which gives us many inputs. We have many inputs from our missions as well as SID, who gives us a lot of information about people, about their views. So it's helped by that civil service, but at the same time, I felt that going beyond scripted lines, being honest, sensitive, as well as respectful, gave us credence, expanded our diplomatic space. I mean, if you always said what others, you think what others want you to say, then why do you need to meet them? But if you say something different, and it feels honest to them. So, for instance, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Europeans I met, and these were legislators as well as leaders, gave a very worrisome line. And they said, you know, we have to stand up against this, not only this, but we have to stand up against China. And I had to say to them that China is not Russia and Taiwan is not Ukraine. And it took a double take. And many of them said, what do you mean? To me and to many ASEAN leaders, that's an obvious statement. To them, it was something foreign, because they had been in an echo box and they had casted and framed this whole issue differently. So when others assess that you're not just being polite, or you always have to be polite, but beyond being polite, that you're also trying to speak honestly and giving your point of view, I think they make time for you and they find your remarks and inputs valuable.
Which other countries does Singapore enjoy that kind of like fluidity with, or is it an approach that you personally take broadly?
We've got quite a good track record. I don't know, but most of the discussions, whether I hold it here in Shangri-La Dialogue, when I go to Munich, or when I go to Tsiangshan Forum, or go to America, are by and large, in the last decade or so, unscripted. I mean, we know all the talking points, but we dive straight into it, and it's some leaders will say to me, walk me through this. We'll walk through this. And you say, all right, the suspense with, walk me through this, and they give you the painted scenario. When somebody gives you a scenario that they worry about, it's revealing part of themselves. They won't do that if they don't have your confidence, or if they think your views are going to be, as I say, pedantic and scripted. So we've enjoyed that, and that's just not due to me. I mean, that's due to decades of leaders having that same approach of our foreign service and our defense attaches and our defense leaders within the SAF and MINDEF, all having the broad acceptance internationally.
From your own experience in defense diplomacy, we see that the geopolitical situation, the environment is changing by the day. What do you think the next generation of leaders and the Singaporeans in general need to understand or know about defense diplomacy and the role that MINDEF and SAF plays, especially when we see rising tensions between the US and China?
If two countries want to go to war, and cannot be persuaded otherwise. They will pull other countries into that confrontation and risk regressing, or at least having no progress for a few decades. This is particularly for Asia. I don't think we have the same ballast as Europe. De facto, you have a war in Europe, fought on the battlegrounds of Ukraine, but they are proxy wars. And it's remarkable that for Europe, for some areas, you can still have economic growth. I think for Asia, geographically and politically, I don't think we have that buffer. Anywhere in Asia, if there's a conflict, whether it's Northeast Asia, whether it's South China Sea, whether it's Straits of Malacca, whether it's in the South Indian continent, you're going to have effects. So I think we have a much smaller buffer, or if you like, to continue economic activity and progress, so we should be careful there. We ought to recognize that for the first time since 80 years now, since World War II, we have an ideology which divides rather than tries to build on a common goal, globalization 1.10. And that occurred after a devastating First and Second World War, millions killed, and where even the colonizers, the colonial powers, realized that there's only so much you can do with imperial systems, with colonies, with extractive policies, and that we better build a better global system that enlarges the common space, enlarges the global commons, and that everyone can work within it to enlarge the global pie. And that was the whole basis of globalization. And it took some time, but after the Cold War, both Russia and China, which were autarkies, joined it. But it was very clear to see once they joined it, and that was basically most of the world, you saw growth, you saw millions, hundreds of millions of people being lifted out of poverty, and you had progress. Not that it was a perfect system, not that it were all winners, but generally it was a rising tide that lifted all boats. Now, was that period normal or abnormal? Remember, that period came after two world wars. There was that psychological detestation of conflict. After 80 years, people may have forgotten. Generations may have forgotten. So generations raised in almost relative peace their entire lives. And now you have competing ideologies. The rules are not optimized for my system, so I want to optimize them. And the other side says the same thing. And for Singapore, what is the danger point? We are a canary in the mine of global trade. GDP is, external trade is 3 times our GDP or more. We should be likened to a shop in an MRT station. Once the train stops or reduces in frequency, you're in trouble. As long as the trains keep going back and forth, I think we can make a living, and a good one. Once people decide that they're going to divert, or use other tracks, or bypass the station, or are not allowed to stop at your station, or reroute it elsewhere, it's beyond your limited agency, and you have to make do. So how do we navigate a world like this? Try to avoid it as much as possible, and it's not us that are going to change the world. So I think the recent US-China breakthrough, and I would characterize this as a breakthrough, from 135 or 145% tariffs to 30% or 10%. We'll take it for now. Hopefully there will be more, but at least it gives us a reprieve. And we will still continue to speak to other countries that, look, it makes much more sense for us to stabilize the global system. There are inadequacies, non-trade tariffs will need to be addressed, unequal practices will need to be addressed. restricting your markets through non-tariff means will have to be addressed, so on and so forth. But generally, I think people know where Singapore stands. We declare it's our vested interest to make sure that global trade continues. But the trick is, can we get people to listen? Can we get people to listen seriously and then take it up within their agency to create a momentum? If we can't do that, then I think we've done something. If we can't, and we have to live with the consequences, it will be a game of catch-up and a very difficult game.
As the outgoing defense minister, in view of all this geopolitical landscape and threats to Singapore, what would you want to say to the next defense minister? What advice would you want to give him or maybe her?
I would say to him or her, when PM Wong finally announces it, that you'll be fine, just do your best. I believe that the new cabinet will have the wherewithal to deal with it. It's, you know, once I understand the attitudes towards, the reaction towards experienced ministers going, but remember that we only got this experience because somebody else allowed us to have the experience in the last, well, for my case, 14 years. And you have to ask yourself, basically, are ministers of good quality? I think yes. Do they have their own age? Do they have their own capabilities? Obviously, and you know they're all well educated and the experience. So I think the next person becoming a defense minister will be fine, and I look forward to his or her contributions. I would say that I'm only human, and I'm really gratified with. It's been an outpouring of gratitude from Singaporeans. We're not used to a social media that's so inviting. I mean, we're usually being used to lambasted and the vitriol, but I suppose I could quip that if I knew it was going to be so positive, I would have quit earlier.
Minister, post-independence, Singapore has not have to go to war at all. And we've seen in recent years and months, we've seen lots of conflicts and spate of attacks, most recently India and Pakistan. So what lessons can we bring home to Singapore on this front?
Absolutely, that's the key point. And that indeed is that my epiphany coming to MINDEF was, as I saw it, the Achilles heel of the SAF. We were, if you like, a victim of his own success. As you grow, I mean, our whole concept of the SAF is defense deterrence, that you build up such a capable military that others would think twice, thrice before entering any conflict with you. That's the whole idea. I mean, Mr. Lee described it as a poison shrimp. I think we're larger than a shrimp now, and you're going to get more than a bellyache. We're quite poisonous at this point of time. But the corollary of that is that you can become complacent, you can untest it, and long-held assumptions may have been outdated and obsolescent. And a couple of remarks by other leaders reaffirmed that epiphany for me. I mean, one was, you know, the often stated view that militaries must be careful that they are not equipped to fight the last war. I mean, that's a reason for it being a much touted proverb, because it's been true many times. You find militaries enter and say, hang on, you know, the way I organize, my equipment has been really what I learned from previous conflicts. And the Ukraine-Russian conflict is a prime example. Nobody envisaged, if they didn't envisage that drone warfare would, even if they didn't envisage that drone warfare would be part and parcel of the military campaign, nobody envisaged the scale of it. Ukraine can now produce 4 million drones a year. Just think about it. And the amount of conflicts, nobody envisaged the information capabilities to have a God's eye view of the battlefield from the moment you leave your origin to reach the destination. Somebody is looking at you all the time, and civilians are looking at you and then reporting your intelligence back. So because of that, and the SAF is very progressive, and I'm very thankful for their strong leadership. And all I had to do was point out that, look, these assumptions, and we have to take them seriously, and we had to restructure to meet future needs. That was in terms of that evolving scenario that we learned from military campaigns. But there was also, in parallel, an expanding paradigm, was that the division between war and peace was blurred, right? How would you describe, for example, information warfare or hybrid warfare? And others have now described it as a war between wars. In other words, you're at war all the time if there's an aggressor. It's just that either you can choose not to recognize it, but you're still at war. Somebody is trying to undermine your social cohesion. Somebody is trying to infiltrate your cyber systems, to knock out your civilian infrastructure. Somebody is trying to steal information. Somebody is trying to target you, even your elections. Somebody is infiltrating your systems, all during peace. Now, whose job is it during times of peace? And that blurred the line between a hard stop between peace and war. And the danger was for the SAF to say, well, this is somebody else's job. And, I will only be called if there's outright declaration of aggression, which can come masked, and that was terrorism. They don't come in uniforms, but they can be deadly. So to deal with terrorism was very useful, where you realize that some of our previous models were outdated, that we had to have information from the word go. And even before that, our intelligence had to be stepped up to learn of threats, terrorist groups that were either gaining strength or aggregating weapons. It forced a paradigm shift for the SAF to realize that these blurred lines expanded their mission scopes, whether it was in the digital space, what we call the gray zone, the hybrid space, but it also meant that the SAF, even peacetime, had an increased tempo. And so I think I've been very happy with the response of MINDEF and SAF leaders who chose to listen to some of my views, and they took it from there and they ran with it. And I would say that a lot of the developments within the past year have been very satisfying. We've done as much as we can to update the SAF for future scenarios. I don't know if what we've done will be enough. The only true test comes in a real crisis, in a real conflict, and nobody wishes that for Singapore. But I could say hand on heart that we've done our best.
On that note, you are Singapore's longest serving
So far,
defense minister so far.
I think. Yeah.
So looking back at your 14 years in this portfolio, what would you say was the most pivotal decision, that helped to transform the SAF and MINDEF and ensure that the SAF stays agile and adaptable?
A big ministry doesn't lend itself for you to wake up one morning and decide that you're going to change direction. It just doesn't work that way. I mean, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of tens of thousands of wheels going on the SAF, and you have real-time operations. It really is the culmination of decades of work from your past leaders since our independence, that the SAF was started building strong fundamentals, bringing good people, elevating leadership. So I would say that if there was any contribution, it was trusting your SAF leaders and your MINDEF leaders that they know what they're doing, that the real-time ops they can take care of, but having, if you like, the luxury to scenario plan within your own mind, to sometimes pontificate, sometimes to deal with counterfactuals, sometimes to deal with things that people in operations really don't have time to think. I mean, somebody who's involved in missions and operations doesn't wake up thinking of theoretical things. He has to deal with real-time people and outcomes. But I suppose it's part of my personality, and that I had, and me meeting people and filling up my data banks, and then sitting down with my senior leadership, said, look, this was one view. So, I'll give you an example. And this was the reason why we decided that we had to expose, and we were already exposed to various leaders around the world, but we did it deliberately, and we engaged others. And this was sometime back in the Munich Security Conference, where even just this concept of hybrid warfare was brought up. This was not now. This was way back then, maybe more than 10 years ago. And I presented it to the House. It was in Parliament. It was seen as something new, and it was like a queer bird. And I told them about the Gerasimov doctrine, which after a famous Russian general. So in that exchange of ideas, you're more likely to get it from the political level, and of course your military leaders are also exposed to them, but they have their real operations to deal with. But it's coming back and saying, look, I think there's something to this, and if this is true, if we're planning ahead, then we really ought to structure ourselves to be able to meet these threats. And that evolved into better counterterrorism structures, response times, equipment, re-engineering our special forces. That evolved itself to digital intelligence service, commands, task force. Now, all that I've described is operational, right? What if I had mooted those ideas and the leadership says, well, those are very good ideas, thank you very much. Thankfully they didn't. I think they were enlightened enough. So I've been very fortunate that we've got very strong leadership within the SAF MINDEF. And my job was to persuade them gently that this makes sense to me. What do you think about it? If we believe this, then let's move faster. Of course, from time to time, I would say, let's move faster on this. I think, we need to catch up on this. But, that's par for the course for a minister. I said one day that our total defense is becoming too military-centric. Total defense means total defense, so we better get people on the act. And so and SAF said, yeah, you're right, okay, we agree. We think there's a point to this. So we decided a couple of years back to involve other agencies and to simulate water shortages for at least a few hours. Cyber attacks, phishing, electrical blackouts, food shortages, right? And as I said, to SAF credit, when they believe in something, they really go at it. And decided that for the total defense, you're going to open up to other ministries and then going to have these exercises. And then it was my turn to, wait, how much disruption are you going to cause to society? But they said, they're all very good fellas. They said, no, it's only for a few hours. And, food distribution to schools, some officers within the CVD were very keen to stop their escalators, test their own systems. They were keen on the phishing attacks towards their own employees, and it came together. And then even with the recent total defense, when there was food poisoning, I said, it's not all negative, because this is going to happen in real time. And this time was a limited exercise, distributed by commercial entities. But if it happened in a real crisis, and you're distributing 1 million packs, and you have so-called food poisoning being reported, and nobody dares to eat what you're distributing, it becomes a crisis. And so this is a lesson learned, and thankfully when they investigated, it wasn't with the commercial supplier, for whatever reason, but it shows you how not accepting assumptions of status quo sometimes can just open the box. And the good news is that a lot of other ministries are very keen to join us now. And I think MINDEF is quite happy to say, okay, you can run with future total defense. And I think the people also recognize that there's a utility there. I mean, all of us assume that, okay, if there's an attack on our system, whether it's remotely by cyber or physical attack, that things will operate as usual, right? That the lifts break down, that life will go on with somebody dealing with it. But there needs to be a core of resilience and self-help, because in a crisis, government can't be everywhere.
So speaking of crisis, you've seen Singapore through multiple crises in your time as Defence Minister. Can you share with us a moment that was perhaps particularly challenging, and whether it had reshaped your perspectives and your thinking back then?
Well, when I took over in 2011, following that, there was a spate of accidents, you remember. It's very personal from the point of view, that there's a loss of life. And there'll be a lot of grief. And remember that I come from a medical background, so I'm used to grief. I'm used to grieving, and I'm used to death. But it never comes easy. You know that it's a loved one whose people depend on it, and so much so in a young person. So it affects you very personally, but you don't have the luxury of wallowing in that, and you have to move the system to one that's confidence. So there I benefited from being at Minister of Manpower, where there was a series of accidents too. Remember the Nickel Highway collapse, the Fusionopolis, the deaths. And when that happened in the Ministry of Manpower, we undertook a root and branch review, systemic review. I remember then with PermSex, we traveled to other countries with higher safety standards, particularly European countries. We looked into their systems. And then we realized that you don't get safety by saying, okay, let's be careful. It doesn't work that way. Everybody goes to work and they're doing tasks. It has to be, you have to design out risk. They said that even when they built buildings, they worried about how maintenance was to be conducted. So they built straight buildings and rather than curvy-wurvy ones, because that required different maintenance, so on and so forth. You design out risks. You have a safety culture of accountability. So I realized from experience in MOM, you needed to institute that in the SAF. It's not that the SAF has low standards of safety then. We are still among the best performing militaries in the world, and even compared to commercial standards, we're among very safe systems. But, any life loss is somebody's son, brother, right? And we said, we have to aim for 0 deaths. And that's a tall order. So we made safety as important to the CO as performance. You're accountable. If something happens and the safety lapse, it's a mark against you. You have to pay attention to this. But we also instituted safety processes that people go through the exercises and recognize where the danger points is, and they out-design it. And I think now AI also lends itself to that now, and we're trying to see how we can apply it. So if there was a useful learning point, it was that from experience in MOM and then translating it. And thankfully, the safety record has been quite good in the last decade, but we know that this is a constant challenge. You have to have constant vigilance for this. And I hope that we'll be able to continue that.
So besides those accidents that you mentioned about and learning from them, right? Your time has also seen quite a number of crises or times where you had to make some tough decisions, say during the pandemic, or managing regional tensions, or even say during the terrorist incident. What's your personal philosophy to getting through these kind of incidents, and what guided you to make the decisions in times of those crises?
Yeah, I mean, by nature, I'm less emotive. So, basically when you're presented a problem, you ask, what is the root cause? Rather than trying to get at the symptoms. What's the core diagnosis? And for the Terexes, we had not evolved with the shipping industry. The shipping industry had become very efficient, and instead of going from point A to point B straight, which may be the most direct, they go through other ports because from a cost perspective, that's more efficient for them. So that was a lapse in our, again, dealing with assumptions, and I think we dealt with that. Diplomatically, we also learned some lessons, but that's for that. The other incident which you mentioned,
And the pandemic, for
the
instance,
pandemic was
COVID-19.
easy because we weren't directly involved in it. MOH, MTI, the other agencies, but as I relate the story, Senior Minister Teo Chee Hean was helping the task force, and he called me up. I was actually with my grandchildren at the zoo because you can only bring them to open spaces, right?
Outdoors.
And the zoo was very open, so it was great. And he says, we need SAF help. It was a very easy decision. Anytime they says the SAF help, the default answer is, yeah, what do you need us to do? And indeed, that's what we did. I sat down, I told my grandchildren, hey, Grandpa needs to take a call. Grandma takes care of them. And I sat down and we have a conference call with SMTO, at the time Lawrence Wong and Gan Kim Yong. And I said, what do you need? Easy decision. And then coming back, it was restructuring and deciding who, and I think the SAF did very well, whether it's dealing with the foreign DOMs, whether it was dealing with COVID patients. That was quite a hair-raising experience to enter Expo with 2,000 COVID patients. We had been tasked to do that. We had brought in reservists to deal with that. Yeah, we issued the ICTs. And when I spoke to them, I was very proud of them. They understood the mission. I said, you make sure you do everything that to prevent you getting sick, and being infected. And they did it. Dealing with 2,000 patients is no joke, and as I entered it, I could see there was order, there wasn't panic. And for DSO, bringing on rapid test kits. So it was the SAF, it's the closest you get to a unprepared crisis, right? And suddenly you're asked to help. And I think they acquitted themselves very well, and I was very happy that they did. And it gave confidence in ourselves as well as the government that the SAF can be called upon for other aspects.
So if I may go back to the point on training safety, you mentioned about using AI. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more?
One of the things that for institutions like SAF is that you do repetitive tasks, right? Whether it's your section, whether it's your battalion, if you're going to take objective, you have a format and many units go through it. That's gathering data. Same set of circumstances, but different data. And the more data you get, that's your data bank. The more soldiers go through that, live firing or exercises, it builds your data bank. And that's the beginning of machine learning. You're only good as your data bank. So many millions or even billion parameters. But once you get the data bank, you can train the AI model to start asking, where are the risks of injury higher in this process? Now, you can get a few people or a few dozen people to sit down and stare at videos and then move to real time and then decide where are the points of high risk. But AI lends itself perfectly to the exercise. So visuals now, computer visuals can be now tokenized, can be now datafied. And to use AI to plot, and then both as a model and as in real time when soldiers go through it, it can alert you. You're outside your range of safety. Stop. Again, the person can do it. But humans have got some frailties which machines can overcome. So, I mean, we're looking at that. It still needs to be tested, but a priori it lends itself to that.
If I may, on that note, how do you see warfare and defense actually evolving in the next decade, especially the rise of, like you mentioned, AI and drones, like you mentioned previously, hybrid threats? Has the SAF, in your opinion, adapted enough to meet these challenges?
We were fortunate that our founding fathers, particularly Dr. Goh Keng Swee, hit upon the idea, whether it was making a virtue out of necessity perhaps, that with our limited manpower, we'll have to leverage off technology, right? I mean, you think about it, I mean, look at our size compared to other larger countries. I mean, if you don't use technology, then what? So he began the technological quest, if you like, to amplify our effects very early. Started with ETC, became DSTA, DSO, then ST as a commercial arm. So we've ridden that wave, and it's evident from all the past decades that the technology rise has been exponential. So I think we've been fortunate from that point of view. I mean, we've got a few thousand engineers at any one point of time working on defense issues, and that's a real substantive strength. Not many countries have that in terms of relativities. Obviously, big countries have more than the thousands. But for our size, I mean, having a few thousand engineers and scientists working at problems allows you the option to plan ahead or to have new systems. So I suspect this will be inherent for the SAF, and the SAF has now taken that as a given, so that in fact we call them the ops tech, that they have embedded teams, that even from ab initio, you have both operations and tech dealing with the problem, rather than previously, you know, ops giving tech as a problem and then tech coming back with the solution and ops saying, well, it doesn't quite work. So they short-circuited that. They said, well, they shortcut that. So to say, no, let's start ab initio, and it's worked quite well. So it's part and parcel of our planning processes. So I think it's a significant leverage.
So if I may, so with this rapid modernization of the SAF, how do we keep human elements central to Singapore's defense?
It will always be central. I mean, you can have all the equipment and technology you want, you have, but if you don't have that fighting spirit, or if you don't think Singapore is worth defending, then, well, we will lose. I mean, Ukrainians showed us that. I remember a meeting that I went to quite early after the Ukrainian conflict, Ukrainian invasion. And one of the leaders was honest enough to say openly, look, the only reason we're here discussing this issue is because the Ukrainians held longer than we thought they could. We'll never want for Singapore to be in a similar situation. So I don't think that's the danger of us, at least for the SAF, thinking that just because we have advanced technology and the machinery that you don't need soldiers, or that you don't need cohesion, or that you don't need a fighting spirit. All that are necessary.
You mentioned that you're stepping up from politics, and we're just curious to hear how do you plan to sort of spend your time, and do you see yourself contributing to Singapore and public life in any other ways?
I didn't enter politics by design. It didn't work out that way, and as you know, I was a practicing surgeon, a cancer surgeon, and quite a busy one with growing practice. And the way it is when you're training to be a surgeon, you really don't have time for much else. I mean, you would read books or newspapers, but that's about as much as you have a tangential interest in matters of national interest. When it affects you, of course, you take a closer interest, but like all Singaporeans. It was only when I became a little bit more established, and I say established, I've only been 4 years in private sector, before that 20 years in public service, hospitals, that I was approached to be a member of parliament, and I thought, well, Well, I think I could do with both because I was dealing mainly with breast cancers at the time, which had become the #1 cancers among women. And there are not that so many emergencies if you do your surgery well. Not so many emergencies, and I thought, well, okay, some time to spare. I mean, this is something worth doing. The challenge became when, after I was elected, that I was asked to join government. I remember the phone call. I was actually in my clinic, seeing patients. In between patients, receptionist tells me, then I think it was DPM Lee, who was tasked to call me and said, "We want you to join government." And this was between patients. One patient.
Do you know what year was this roughly?
This was in 2001, after the elections. Yeah. And that we're going to have an economic review committee. I'd like you to lead one of the groups. That incident was after I agreed to join government. Back up a little bit about that. The first decision that was asked, and this was a call to say, well, we're going to have an economic review committee, because when I agreed to join government, I said I need to come in 1 month later to wind down my surgery, because I was still operating, even when I decided, and there were lists. Sometimes you list your surgical cases, and you have to wind down. It was a solo practice. I couldn't hand it to anybody. And you have to tell your patients, and that phone call was saying, he's starting an economic review committee. And remember, this was the time there was he wanted to do economic restructuring. But before that, it was a difficult choice to make. And I was very thankful that at the time Prime Minister Goh asked if I would enter government. Thankful that he asked, but it made me have to contemplate a difficult choice, because it was a full-fledged surgical practice, and I was the only person in the clinic. I've been there for 4 years. It would mean, I've been training to do that. And after 20 years, I decided that, well, private sector would be something I would like to do. It gave me more time to doctor, to deal with individual patients. And I was thankful that they arranged for me to speak, because I had no clue what being in government meant. Put yourself in my shoes. You've just been training all your waking hours as a surgeon. You had been sent by the government to top cancer centers in New York, in Houston, in MD Anderson. And you've seen the best systems, and you're trying to come back and practice those standards. And then, almost out of the blue, you're given the decision to stop and change tack. You can't use your surgical skills in politics, I don't think. Different fields. Yeah. And anyway, in surgery, patients are anesthetized. PM Goh arranged for me to speak to both DPM Lee at that time and Mr. Lee. DPM gave his views, which were helpful. Mr. Lee, of course, you stand in awe of him. And I remember meeting him in a parliament, and it was just a room with us, one-on-one. And he started by asking me and said, "What do you want to do in life?" I knew what he meant, and I jumped straight into it without having to give him a long preamble, and says, "I don't know anything about governing." And I basically said that, look, if I'm going to do this, then it must be, I must see myself adding value, and that I will be a part of the solution to some problem and not be a problem, right? So I asked him, how long would it take for me to find out about him? I wasn't worried about, if I couldn't be effective or couldn't contribute, then I should get out and maybe go back. I don't know whether it was possible, or go back to surgical practice. I don't know how that's possible. So I basically wanted to ask him, how long does it take, do you think, for me to find out? Not for others to find out. I think I would know first. He said 6 months. It was a difficult decision because it's a completely different field, and you're giving up something, never mind the quantitative aspects, but it will be futile for everybody if you change and you neither helped your patients then or helped the country. So that was my primary concern. One thing led to another, and this 24 years down the line, and I'm retiring after that. So it's, by way, quite a long answer to your short question, what are you going to do with your retirement after this? But I'm trying to tell you that I've been working very hard for more than 40 years.
I think no one does that, Doctor.
Both as a surgeon as well as in politics. In surgeon, as a surgeon, life is set. You wake up, and as a training once in America, we would wake up at 5, start rounding at 5:30, and then, after rounding, seeing your patients, you would review journals, and then do clinics, do surgery, and then you repeat the whole process at night because you have to make sure that the patients are well, and then go back, right? And that's repeated day in, day out because they are patients. You have live patients that you want to keep alive and well. Every day, the problems don't go away. So, people ask me, what are you going to do after you retire? I honestly haven't thought about it. It's not as if if a cabinet minister, you go to work thinking, what do I do after I retire? If you're doing that, I suggest to you that you really ought to retire. But I have good friends who have given me suggestions, offers. I think who are thinking of my retirement, but I probably want to take a month or two to reflect on how I can add value and what is it that I would find in a comfortable space. I'm coming from more a position of anything beyond this is good to have, not need to have. And as I said in my short essay, my Facebook post, the best is yet to be, and I want to believe that.
Just now you mentioned about Mr. Lee telling you about 6 months to get to know how long it takes for you to find out what you can contribute. So how long do you take?
I'm still finding out.
So at which part did it click to you that, okay, I can do this, and this is something that I can see myself doing for the next X number of years?
Well, that wasn't a frame. It's how do you measure effectiveness as a political office holder? Thankfully, in 2001, there wasn't social media. If today you enter political office and you use your yardstick as your social media response, I say give it up. Neither is that the real world. We know that there's a sad fact of social media. You have to either decide to tune out or tune in. You can't ignore it. You have to take it in. If you give too much, you empower those who are negative all the time. You create a momentum of its own. If you ignore it, it's not down to reality. So I would say thankfully that there wasn't that. You could decide in your quiet moments. And you can tell, first of all, I think being a political office holder is different from MPs, and we do both MP work as a government, as a minister. And both need to be like helicopters, right? You have to go up, look at the larger policies, the larger terrain, and then come down and deal with ground issues, ferry people, goods, and you have to do both. I suppose as a government minister, you have to fly higher because you have to see the bigger picture. It just reminds me when Aceh tsunami, we had to use the Chinooks because only the Chinooks crossed the mountains. And by nature, I don't have a problem in seeing the bigger picture. It's just less emotive, more logical. So that wasn't a difficult part at all. Medicine is very much harder in terms of trying to define the problem as in politics, compared to politics. Medicine has got many more variables. Politics, the variables are few, but the outcome can be infinitely different. You can spend a lot of resources and get a terrible outcome from a response. And you say, why could I have been so silly in thinking about this? And the political genius, of course, of Mr. Lee was being able to find a policy which may not have been the best policy, a good policy with great outcomes that was acceptable to all. And I remember him saying to me that, it's an off-cited quote, that politics is the art of the possible, not of the art of the impossible. That takes learning. If I look back, there were certain policies I would have done differently, even if I think I'm right. And in politics, you must do something which you think is right, because otherwise you wear your soul down. If you constantly do what you think others think is right, then what they should be in politics, not you. But you're in a position, you see a problem, you know it's hard, that you need to deal with this problem, there will be reactions. Everybody likes status quo, even though there's a problem. Everybody has needs. Everybody needs to have more needs that are met, but the solutions don't square. And you need to do the right things to find a path that leads us to a better place and to be able to carry along people with you. So I think, was 6 months enough? 6 months was enough to tell me that the basic skill sets were there. I didn't have much of a problem understanding or grasping what the core problem was. The art of the possible takes a lifetime to learn. If I had another political life, I would want to do it again. Maybe without that so much of social media again, because that's really hard, and you know it's very hard to tune. We're all human. When somebody says negative, something negative against you, you try to suppress it, but it hurts. Who doesn't want affirmation? And well, it is what it is, and we all have to learn to accept it. But at times it's gratifying. I mean, social media is both wonderful, at the same time, there are dark aspects. And you have to live with day-to-day criticisms now. I worry sometimes about that. I worry not more so for politicians, but even more so for their families. That their families may say, I don't want this scrutiny. I don't want this day-to-day criticisms.
So after 24 years in political office, what is one key takeaway that you have about balancing political office as well as personal integrity, and what advice would you give the next generation of leaders?
I don't think you can balance it. I think integrity is the core of your being. I'm not being moralistic. I mean, we all have sinned and fallen short, and all of us have flaws. But do you say what you mean, and do you mean what you say? And when you've given a undertaking and a promise, do you keep it? Do you speak intentionally to obfuscate with a forked tongue, or do you want to speak plainly? I hope that the standard of politics will continue, that integrity is core, and whatever political party, if integrity is not core to our political process, I think we're on very slippery ground. And I think the recent elections, among all the positive aspects, obviously the PAP is very happy, and I'm sure Prime Minister Lawrence Wong and the cabinet is very happy with the results and thankful. But to me, when someone who is going out of politics, it was particularly gratifying because the vote, the results, were an affirmation of rational and progressive politics. Just think of if you didn't have that positive outcome, and obviously as a vested interest as a PAP member, but that aside, let's say that the ruling party and even the opposition says we are not out to be the government, and the PAP will still be the government. But let's assume that, as all of us assume, that the PAP will still be the ruling party, they will still be the government, but it got in the low 50s. That would have been a vote that was ambiguous. Because you have a ruling government that basically has done, and we're not perfect, fairly well with crisis, whether it was global financial crisis, whether it was COVID-19, that has stood up for issues of integrity, that has dealt with it the best it is possible. And some could say you could have done more. All right, no arguments there, right? Let's take that as a given. You could always do something more and we'll learn. But if you had not done as well, what are future generations of people aspiring to political office, what will be their takeaway? This is not rational or not progressive. In the times like this, for Singaporeans to say, okay, I believe what you say, we're entering a difficult period, let's be rational, we trust you with this. And that's a solid vote for, hopefully for Singapore, whatever the outcomes, whether it's in 20, 30, 40 years. I mean, when Mr. Lee was asked to think of the long-term future of Singapore, he didn't give a definitive answer. And there is no definitive answer. The definitive answer depends on each generation. So I think the government, the people as much as the government, has the responsibility to decide what kind of politics they want. And someone can say, well, you're saying that because you're in a ruling party. I don't think so. You want rational politics where good policies are supported and bad policies are not supported, whatever political color you are, that there is enlightenment to say, well, that's a great idea, but if everybody is asking for more and you're giving it, who are you going to tax to pay for it? Uncomfortable questions, reality questions, or for some to say, well, that's a good idea, but this is the downside. And more with educated Singaporeans, that discourse must come up. So I think SG Forward is a good initiative. And Singaporeans, let's face it, right? We're very different. The percentage of university-educated Singaporeans has gone up by leaps and bounds compared to the 1960s. But just as we are educated, I think we also need to be more progressive and enlightened. And I hope that, we can continue that.
So as you leave the cabinet, as well as your position as an MP, what would you miss the most?
Not much. It depends on what you have, the alternative. And my alternatives are certainly more enjoyable, grandchildren, leisure, golf. I think if there's anything to miss is the intellectual stimulation. But I can fulfill that in other ways. I read a lot in my spare time, so, I can spar with the books that I read. But it is the inflow of information streams that you can distill and then come to your own conclusion and then test it in the marketplace of ideas that's useful. So I think that's a much. I won't miss, for example, the formalities nor the trappings of office. I've never been from the private sector. I mean, I've always felt comfortable with security guards, and I won't miss that. And my staff know me. I abhor formalities, and they know that I'll dispense with them very quickly.
And what would you miss the most about being an MP?
Oh, I just had a appreciation dinner for my grassroots leaders. I said to them that if there was one thing, and I've been asked before, that decision from surgeon to politician, was it worth it? And I said one aspect which was infinitely worth it was making new friends. I would have never met them otherwise. I'm a cancer surgeon, and they don't really want to see me professionally. But in Singapore, and this is aside from political affiliation, you really have the salt of the earth people, and as I said, honest to goodness people. Just at the core being very honest, and it's got nothing to do with wealth. Some of the poorest people have been the most generous in my dealings with me, in their fellow citizens. And I think if there's anything that holds Singapore, it's them. So, we promised to keep in touch. There's a very sweet lady who, during our Meet the People sessions, brings Yu Chakwe and Han Chin Peng, and she's promised to, if I visit them, to bring back that, and there's another lady that cooks for us. So all these little acts of kindness add up. We're all, at the end of the day, human, and we want affirmation. No human wants to revel in the climate of negativity and criticism. It eats our soul up. And if you're in that situation, and if you're creating that situation, well, good luck to you. I don't know how you can deal with yourself, but that's not the human experience that we yearn for. All of us, at the end of the day, want to be able to say, I've done this to the best of my ability. I tried to do some good, and if I have shortcomings, I apologize, but I tried my best. And I think the grassroots leaders epitomize that. They do it. So that, I think, will be one aspect which I will miss. But, you know, we promised to keep in touch, so that's quite good. I mean, we've become family friends with our spouses, our families, so it's made it much more enjoyable.
So on a more personal note, what would you consider to be your key milestones in your political life?
I think it will be seeing an organization grow, whether it was in MOM, whether it was MOE, whether it was in MINDEF. You're not, a word of advice, if you ask for a word of advice, don't enter the politics to be thanked. It's setting a very high bar, and you may be disappointed. But politics in Singapore, I would say that politics is still an avenue when you can do good without compromising your ideals. And I would say that that may not be so in other systems. But if you believe in the direction that Singapore should go, and you think that it will benefit Singapore, politics is one arena where you can still do good. And if you look at it's little things in the MOE, for example, I mean, starting up institutions that you see people going to, whether it's in a university or single session schools or education and character, and seeing them, continue, or in MOM, CPF Life, or in MINDEF. It's just a little satisfaction knowing that you build on something that somebody else had already started and somebody else could continue. By and large, we've made progress as a society. That can't be said for a lot of other countries. So we should take our blessings where we can, and I think we should try to keep it where people who aspire to do good for our society will find meaning in politics. And we should make it less difficult, if we can.
What do you mean difficult?
The scrutiny into personal lives, the criticism, the scrutiny into family members' lives, the vitriol, that doesn't make it difficult. You're not human if it doesn't make you difficult. You're void of emotions. And who is void of emotions?
So looking ahead, what gives you the most hope, and what gives you pause about Singapore's future?
Good question. It's remarkable how much we've progressed, right? And sometimes I speak, and these are the facts, from per capita of 600 US in 1960s at independence to now even higher than Japan, highest in Asia, right? 6 figures. And there's a price to be paid for the rapid rise. And that price is to believe that it can always continue, and that it was preordained or a given fact that our trajectory was a given anyway. I remember a story that PM Goh at the time, SM Goh, shared how when in his class in Williams in college in the States, where he had entered 30 all bright and upcoming leaders of society, and they were asked, and I think this was in the 60s, I think, when they were asked to name 3 countries that they think in 30 or 20 years hence will be the leading countries in Asia. 3 countries were Philippines, Burma, and Sri Lanka, because that was the prevailing wisdom. So if you were to ask Same question that was applied to Mr. Lee, or asked Mr. Lee, in 50 years' time, will Singapore continue to enjoy this standing and progress and wealth? And what determines that answer? First, the people, of course, but politics is core of that. And if you look at the way that developed countries have become, more have fallen than risen, right? Take any countries. We don't want to be impolite, but look at the world map and just compare a developed country, say 20 or 30 years ago, and its standing today, of its social cohesion, of its infrastructure, of its ability to deal with health problems, transport, fiscal strength. I mean, just basic objective parameters. And then ask how many countries have been able to maintain high standards. And of that, when they were in high standing, whether they were able to progress or become worse. And the truth is that it's hard to stay on top or stay good. And what is the curse? The curse of successful countries, I think, is the belief that the set of conditions that you've inherited will be forever so. I mean, that's very natural, right? Chinese has a saying, 富不过三代, right? The first generation strives for it, started from poverty, understood, not only understood, lived through poverty, and to them anything is on the way up. The second generation got transmitted some values, also saw for themselves the ascent. The third generation was born into comfort and wealth and couldn't maintain it. I mean, it's completely natural. It's what these proverbs come out from. So how does Singapore guard against that? I think it's the question that we have to ask. How do we guard against it? And there are no easy answers. How do we keep at this level of progress? There will always be unequal distribution, and we'll have to narrow that for sure. But first of all, it's the standard of wealth. You don't want to be the country that's poor and dealing with unequal distribution. That makes it much harder, or even in the middle, right? The middle income trap. You want to be a progressive country. And I think that must be the question that occupies all of us. How do we continue to, and what are the fundamentals that will get us there? And I think part of the answer is that social compact, the political understanding between elected and electorate, to have a common understanding of, some things may be good, but we can't afford it. And we may have to find different solutions or different expectations. Or some things are too expensive and we should learn to live with less. Or some things we are not investing in that we should invest in now. Or make the more, So we've come to a situation where Singaporeans travel, they understand, and you may have to find wisdom from many sources of the population.
Talking about progress, some critics from the Malay Muslim community, especially the older generations, would think that there is still this thought that the government does not offer senior key roles in MINDEF and SAF to Malays because they question their loyalty, Malay loyalty. So, but in media reports, we've shown that there are many Malay individuals who are successful in SAF and also in MINDEF. So what do you have to say to critics who continue to perpetuate these arguments that the government thinks that Malays are not loyal?
I won't answer that specifically because that may be framing the issue too narrowly. You can look at societies through the lens of race, right? And then you can further segment it. For the Chinese, you can even ask for figures between Hokkiens, Teochew, Cantonese dialect groups, local born versus foreign born, one parent, two parent, and then you do the same for Indians then you do the same for Malays, and you do the same for other races. Where does that get you? You frame your whole perceptions and outcome through a lens of race. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. I'm not saying that it's possible not to do it. Because we are who we are. I mean, that's our makeup. And we ask our situation and we view it. But to view society in totality through the lens of race leads you to certain outcomes. You will be comparing all the time. And the truth is that within groups, however you define it, identity politics, they call it, there will always be some who do better and some who do less. And that's the reality. And the whole problem with this identity politics is that it leads to other aspects. And this was the whole, the woke culture, cancel culture, which now you have. And you've got to recognize when you start that, you're going to have a counterculture, right? Because your questions basically lead to the assumptions that if you're going to redress it, the answers must be through the lens of race as well. And that's just setting up our society along those lines. Now, is it possible to go towards another model, a melting pot model? Others have tried. There are difficulties. So Singapore found a balance to say, well, this is the reality. Race and religion are always part of our society, and to dismiss it or to try to downplay it, like some European countries do, isn't realistic. And so our laws are crafted like that. Don't you go demeaning or creating, incidences. If you say something against a religion, race, we're going to take a more difficult view. The idealists and the liberals will say, well, that's censoring. We take a more pragmatic view. I think it's easier to deal with it. We just tell people, hands off, because this can be too incendiary. But the reverse can also be true, that I push for affirmative action based on identity. And that's not always virtuous. That's not always virtuous, neither for the outcomes nor the recipient of the affirmative action. And countries do that, European countries even. So, for example, some of them require gender neutrality. In other words, all occupations must have aimed towards gender neutrality. I don't know the wisdom for that, but we haven't applied it. So we've taken the view that race and religion are part and parcel of Singapore life, that we treat them with sensitivity. We also taken the view that constitutionally the Malays are given privileges, some privileges, and that's worked in the system, there's self-help groups. But overlying all of that is based on hierarchy, the principle of meritocracy, where somebody who's capable must never be held back because of race or identity. And if anybody knows that this person, Singapore, you can always go to social media and say, I think this person should be such and such, and he's held back because of that. I wouldn't suggest posting in social media. That's not a good place to test your market of ideas. But even among smaller groups, the ideas get tested. So I think the right question to ask is our society fair? And that's an easy question, but it's also a complex one. I think there are instruments or circumstances that you can improve what they talk about social equity, right? So are there hidden hurdles, for example, among women? And if you think about it, there are. So previously, let's say for working mothers, if you didn't have nursing, breastfeeding facilities, childcare, you create problems because the mother can't work because she doesn't have peace of mind. And you have to address that. You may have to address that if you think that there are similar aspects that are applied to race. I think you have to argue why there should be special dispensation, or not even special, the necessary dispensation. So enlightened employers now have de-rigor nursing rooms and working spaces. So I think that's more a productive aspect. when it comes to MINDEF and the SAF, we promote based on ability and aptitude. We ask people, do you want to be an officer? And we ask the peer review, can this person be an officer? And you say higher echelons may not be represented. Well, we have previous SMSs, but I don't think that's the test. The test is one of fairness and whether you want our system to be tilted towards more a system where you view outcomes based on race, religion, and identity. I think that's a question for Singaporeans to decide, and I mean that. If you push for this and make it an electoral issue, in other words, if your systems don't change and you don't favor this particular race or this identity, I'm going to vote against you. We become polarized, which is exactly what is happening to Europe, whether it's the alt-right, whether it's happening to America, whether it's Republicans against the Democrats. There are Republicans and Democrats standing for different values and different segments of society. And that's why when you ask me, what do I think what Singapore will be, it's exactly these choices. That vote, as I said, this vote for rationality and progress was positive because the converse would also be true. If you vote for a particular brand of politics that divides, that favors one group over the other, rather than a common principle of meritocracy, of equity, of opportunities, well, you get what you want. And it hasn't worked for many developed countries. I don't know that Singapore can avoid it. One hopes so.